Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills are the videos where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading. I don't really call them reviews, they're really just discussions. My videos are informal and unscripted, so you kind of get what you get. I'm going to be talking today about George Orwell's 1984 and John Meacham's The Soul of America. So I'll start with this because I read this at the end of September. And yeah, this was sort of a reread for me. So this edition, you can see, also has Animal Farm on it. I read Animal Farm, or reread Animal Farm a couple of years ago. I just didn't get to 1984. Now, 1984 is a book that I had tried reading, I'm pretty sure when I was a teenager. I think I was still in high school. And over the years, I wasn't sure, looking back on it, if I had actually finished the book or not. Partly because I couldn't remember a lot about the plot. So I just kind of assumed that I must have only read maybe half of it and that was it. Now, rereading it, I think I understand why I only felt like I was remembering about half of it, because I think that the plot is maybe one of the more weaker aspects of the book. It's fairly thin. So let me just kind of go into some of my thoughts. I mean, most people will know what 1984 is, and I will say I didn't dislike 1984. I think it's a really interesting book. I don't think that it works as well as a novel as it does as sort of like a political essay almost. So we have, this is published, I think, 1949. So it takes place in for them, for Orwell, but in a futuristic 1984, at least they think it's the year 1984, where Europe, well, we're in England for this book, really is completely controlled. The government has total control over the people. This kind of dictator figure called Big Brother, which we're not even sure if he really exists or not. And it goes into the life of this one individual who's part of the ruling party, but is very discontent and is trying to find ways to kind of break out and be more free, but finding that the party ultimately has more control over him than he ever imagined. I don't want to get into spoiler territory. My videos are generally non-spoiler. So the thing is, a lot about the plot itself is fairly thin. I mean, I think we have an interesting central character, but the plot itself, again, thin. A lot of the other supporting characters are also fairly thinly drawn. And there comes a point for me in the story where there's certain revelations that happen, certain things are revealed to the character that start to stretch too much credulity. Like Orwell is almost kind of overstepping how much a government would invest in a single individual and try and break them down over a series of years. So I guess it kind of works for his plot, but it made it harder to accept in a lot of ways. Now again, as a novel, for purely, if we're looking at it for more like artistry and entertainment, it's just kind of okay. What the value, of course, of 1984 is in all the sort of insight that it gives one about the way that totalitarian governments can, exert their influence over people and control. That's where you really find value inside the book. And that's what I think really makes it worth it. Because there are certainly scenes where we have incredibly long exposition, which I don't always like inside a novel. But there's also like some sort of like nuggets of gold. Like I have this one part tabbed that it's just one of these ideas that I think everybody should be exposed to. So I'll just kind of read a couple sections here. This is all about, he's reading a book about the way that the government sort of controls things economically. So, quote, nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to a great extent during the final phase of capitalism, roughly between 1920 and 1940. The economy of many countries was allowed to stagnate. Land went out of cultivation. Capital equipment was not added to. Great blocks of the population were prevented from working and kept half alive by state charity. But this, too, entailed military weakness, and since the privations it inflicted were obviously unnecessary, it made opposition inevitable. The problem was how to keep the wheels of industry turning without increasing the real wealth of the world. Goods must be produced, but they must not be distributed. And in practice, the only way of achieving this was by continuous warfare. The essential act of war is destruction, not necessarily of human lives, but of the products of human labor. War is a way of shattering to pieces, or pouring into the stratosphere, or sinking in the depths of the sea, materials which might otherwise be used to make the masses too comfortable and hence, in the long run, too intelligent. Even when weapons of war are not actually destroyed, their manufacture is still a convenient way of expending labor power without producing anything that can be consumed. So I'll just cut it off there. I mean, the ideas that are embedded in just that paragraph and a half, I think, are incredibly important for people to, again, be exposed to consider, to think about the way that, you know, maybe your own nation's budget is allocated. So there are so many gems like that within the book. Again, it doesn't make for a great like narrative drive, but it's a terrific as far as like sort of you know, political essay relating to totalitarianism. So yeah, I think that I might have actually finished reading the book back in my teens, which would have been back in the 1990s. But the reason that I had remembered so little of the plot was because there was so little of plot. But of course, I would still recommend people check out 1984, not for the, you know, again, compelling story that's being told, but because of how incredibly important the political ideas are. And I read this as, I wanted to reread it anyway, but I read this as part of the sort of banned books project that I'm participating in this year, where I looked at a bunch of the books on my shelves, especially the fiction shelves that are on the bookcases back here, and I compared what was on my shelves to what was on a bunch of banned books lists, and basically I decided I would read 10 of them this year, and this was one of them. And of course, when we say banned books, we're really talking about challenged books, but for, I think, obvious reasons, I can see why 1984 would ruffle some people, you know, the wrong way. So anyhow, that is Orwell in 1984. And then the first book that I read for October is John Meacham, The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. This came out in 2018, I believe. I can just double check that real quick. Yeah. And this was one of those books, among others that came out around this time, that I refer to as books that came out dealing with the sort of crisis of American conscience. Trump had been elected, and you had a lot of people, especially historically minded people, who were trying to seek, you know, maybe some precedent in the past, and of course not really finding much when it came to Trump, and trying to figure out a way to the future, and really to see, you know, if we look at the past, do we have a semblance that the future will be better as we continue moving forward? Can we get beyond the current crisis of the, 2018? So John Meacham, I had read his book about Jefferson, which I think was The Art of Power. I might be remembering that title wrong, but I thought it was a pretty good work about Jefferson. So this is only my second John Meacham book that I've read. I do actually own a couple others. And in here, he is essentially looking at roughly 100 years of American history, from like the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War, to just after really the end of the Civil Rights Movement. So, and what he's doing is he's looking at, again, the soul of America. He's basically looking at the sort of struggle that America was having with its own moral conscience in a lot of ways, especially as it deals with things like civil rights, racial equality, for a little bit of the book, also women's suffrage. And he's looking at the way that the United States was sort of handling this, and with a particular focus on the way presidents were handling the situations as well. It's not strictly about the presidents, but we do end up having long sections where it really talks about what the presidents at the time were doing. And there were presidents who stepped up to the cause and came out okay in the end, and others who really didn't. And sometimes it was a mix of the both of them. We get a little bit about Lincoln in the very beginning, and then we kind of get the, sort of terrible administration of Andrew Johnson. Then he gets into Grant, and I kind of wish that he spent a little more time with Grant, but that was okay. It was kind of a shorter section. He spent a lot of time on Teddy Roosevelt. He spends a good deal of time also on Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, who kind of comes out, he he had the right idea when it came to women's suffrage at the time, but his racial stuff is, really going against his record. And he goes through, of course, FDR is a big one. He goes and talks about Truman, talks about Eisenhower, and he spends a lot of time, especially with LBJ. And I think that it's a pretty balanced look overall at a lot of these individuals. And seeing, especially which presidents sort of, took a moral high road, took the right steps, and sometimes what it cost them politically in the end. So this is also a book that has, there's quite a few images in here, which is nice. You don't always get that, but there's quite a few photographs and things like that to go along with it as well. And I enjoyed this overall. I think that Meacham's a good writer, and he pulls through a lot of different sources. I mean, his notes section, I just start with, his notes start here. So we've got ample documentation for a lot of things that he's talking about, which is really nice. But I like this overall. I think he comes out, overall hopeful, but with a cautious hopefulness. But yeah, so The Soul of America, a pretty solid read. So those are two of the latest books that I have finished. So I read George Orwell's 1984 at the end of September. At the beginning of October, I got through The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels by John Meacham. If you've read either of these, love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.